Let's look at the voltage gated potassium channels. So at around positive 30 millivolts, the voltage gated potassium channels are going to open, and potassium is going to move according to its ECDF, which we know is out of the cell and weakly so, right? So when this channel opens up, potassium is going to move out of the cell. Okay, and again, it's going to be trying to approach its equilibrium potential. It will never actually reach that, but that is going to dictate the direction of its movement. So here we can see that the channel is closed at rest. And then during the depolarizing phase of the action potential, it's going to be triggered to be opened up. And then in the refractory period, it's going to be inactivated as well. Okay. If we think about the potassium channels, they have one gate. It's voltage and time dependent. And the potassium channels exhibit what's referred as negative feedback. So we talked about negative feedback before. The change that comes about with potassium channels moves us closer to set point. So if we think about negative 70 millivolts as being our set point, sodium's movement moves us away from that. So sodium can be considered as positive feedback for a temporary period of time. And then potassium can be considered negative feedback because potassium's movement is out of the cell, bringing the cell back down to negative, which is closer to rest. And so that can be a negative feedback as it gets closer to set point. So there's one gate on potassium channel, so it's not as complicated to understand, and it is both voltage and time dependent. So when that timer goes off at positive 30, this is what triggers the membrane potential to change. Instead of continuing to go positive beyond positive 30, it's going to result in the closure of sodium channels, which we just described, but then the opening up of potassium channels that will go all the way back down to rest. Okay, and I really want to reiterate that the time component is triggered at depolarization at negative 55. Again, that 1 millisecond will be in coordination with the 1 millisecond event that's happening on the sodium channels. So basically, when we get to negative 55, that 1 millisecond timer goes off. After 1 millisecond, potassium channels open up, and then the inactivation gate on sodium channels close, and so the membrane potential rapidly shifts. Sodium is no longer moving in, but now potassium is moving out, and so that gives us the downward slope of the action potential. Okay, so let's look at that here in a different way. So again, just reiterating that the membrane permeability is as a result of the type of channel that is open and the ECDF of the ions that are able to move depending on that channel. So the action potential has a rapid depolarization. And again, just kind of zooming out and thinking about the big picture here, that can be used for communication across long distances. Because the action potential is sustained, because it can travel down the axon, we can use the action potential as a way to send signals from one neuron to the other, or from neurons to muscle cells, etc. So the phases of the action potential, is the depolarization. That is all created by sodium's movement. So at negative 55, which is the threshold, there's a depolarizing event. At positive 30, there are two things happening. Because of the change of sodium's state, especially the inactivation gate, and because of the change of potassium channels, the membrane potential rapidly does a 360, and the repolarization phase is brought about as potassium begins to move and sodium no longer moves. This is what brings us back to negative 70, which is the rest. And then there's a short period of hyperpolarization where the membrane potential goes a little bit more negative than negative 70, and then it will come back to rest when the sodium-potassium pumps reestablish the resting membrane potential. Okay. If we think about this in terms of the feedback, so what we just described, at threshold, the voltage-gated sodium channels open up, sodium rushes in. That can be considered a positive feedback change. Again, because we're moving away from set point. If we think about negative 70 as our set point, when sodium ions move into the cell, this moves the membrane potential away from that value, and that will be considered positive feedback. And if we think about what we said about positive feedback, the fact that it is temporary, the fact that it is just a short period of moving away from set point, just for a desired result, and then ultimately that is ended by another negative feedback. That's the exact scenario that we see here. So ultimately, this positive feedback is ended at positive 30, and then a negative feedback loop is initiated, which gets us back to set point. And so we can consider potassium's movement as that negative feedback event. All right. If we look at the permeability down here, again, the permeability is simply a reflection of what channels are open. So as the membrane permeability for potassium increases, that is reflective that sodium channels are open. All right, and then the sodium channels become inactivated here at positive 30. Meanwhile, potassium channels become activated, and then we can see potassium moving the membrane potential more negative. All right. Okay, so that's kind of being reiterated here as well. Now, just to really explain again why the action potential comes about, it is exciting the membrane. So it is the ability to create a potential that excites the membrane and it allows the cell to send this signal. And again, we really want to think about the fact that the action potential is sustained, all right? Not like graded potentials, or spontaneous potentials, which we'll talk about in cardiac. Those will dissipate. But for action potentials, those are going to be sustained so they can travel along the axon. They can result in exocytosis. They can result in the stimulation of muscle. And so we can really use this potential to result in changes on other cells. Okay. Let's look at a few checkpoint questions here. So let's pause briefly. Forgot to resume recording. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right, so that's just describing the depolarization of the axon and how sodium is moving in to cause the upward stroke here. Potassium is moving out to cause the downward stroke here. And then the sodium-potassium pumps sort of begin resetting that membrane potential to rest. Okay, let's look at this from the perspective of the permeability, right? And I think we kind of mentioned this earlier, but if we think about the permeabilities and how they change from one state to the other, this is just a different perspective of looking at the same events. So we start off at rest with the membrane permeability being greater for potassium than it is for sodium. This we know is true, because we described this when we talked about the establishment of the resting membrane potential. Because there are more leak channels for potassium, potassium is more freely moving, and so when the membrane potential is at rest, it closer resembles potassium's equilibrium potential, and it's really far away from sodium's equilibrium potential. So the permeability for potassium is greater than that of sodium when the cell is at rest. All right, and if you look at the graph here, here's what's happening with the action potential in red. The purple line shows sodium's equilibrium, sodium's permeability. So sodium's permeability starts, and then when the sodium channel opens up, it's going to rapidly increase as sodium moves into the cell. And then when the inactivation gates close, it's going to rapidly decrease, right, as sodium is no longer able to move. Alternatively, potassium's permeability starts off a little bit higher than sodium, which we know is true when the cell is at rest. And then when potassium channels open up, really midway the duration of the action potential. So potassium channels don't open up until the cell is positive 30. So this is the point in which these potassium channels will open up, and then we can see that potassium's permeability begins to increase. And although this is showing an upward stroke in this curve, we want to think about the membrane potential as becoming more negative. So look at the red curve to really see what the action potential curve is looking like, what the membrane potential is looking like. That is becoming more negative as potassium's permeability increases. And then when we get back down below -70, potassium's permeability begins to decrease as those potassium channels gradually close. And then when potassium's permeability levels off, the sodium potassium pumps are what are going to really help to reestablish the -70 resting membrane potential. All right. So thinking about that, the graded potentials help to bring us to get to this threshold, and then the opening up of the channels subsequently result in the membrane potential change. Okay, now this is just being reiterated again and again in the same exact concepts, just looking at them in different ways. So the opening up of the potassium channels and the closing of sodium channels is the reason that the action potential never actually gets to +60. So we talked about this idea before, the fact that the movement of sodium is being dictated by the equilibrium potential for sodium, which is way up here at +60. And so whenever sodium channels open up, sodium is going to move in an attempt to approach that equilibrium potential, but it is never actually going to get there because of the timed component and the voltage sensitive component of the sodium channels. So they're going to be completely inactivated at +30. And so that's going to result in sodium no longer being able to move. And then potassium channels are going to then open up, and potassium is going to begin moving out of the cell. And so the membrane potential will start becoming more negative, and therefore it will never actually reach +60. All right. As far as what's happening with potassium channels are going to stay open a little bit longer past the membrane potential getting to -70. This is the reason for the undershooting of the membrane potential. So the cell doesn't just become, the membrane potential doesn't stop moving when we get to -70. Because it is trying to approach potassium's equilibrium potential, it's going to get more negative than -70. It's going to get to about -80 or so. And then all of the potassium channels will eventually close by then, and then the sodium potassium pumps will help to reestablish the resting membrane potential. Okay, so here's that final component. The closure of potassium channels happens. The sodium potassium pumps begin to reestablish the resting membrane potential, and then we get back to rest, and then sodium channels will get back to their original state, which is where the channel is once again closed but capable of being open. So there's a short refractory period where potassium is still moving, sodium channels are still inactivated. So even if we did have a graded potential that was -55 or greater, another action potential is not going to be able to occur because the channel here for sodium is going to be inactivated until we get back to -70. Until we get back to -70, it's not possible to initiate another action potential. All right. Okay. So let's go ahead. I think this is reiterating the same idea. We get back to -85 because potassium is slightly moving, trying to get to its equilibrium potential. And then the sodium potassium pumps help to bring us back up to -70, which is closer to our rest.